Welcome back everybody to another MOTOBOB video, and this week BMW announced a massive update to their super popular distance-orientated mile-munching large capacity adventure bike, the GS Adventure. So in this video we'll go through all of the key details with the 11 things that you need to know about it. Now first up, we've got to talk about the looks because this is a really big visual redesign and they've taken a very bold direction, let's say. Personally, I already thought the 1300GS was, a big change that was going to take people a lot of getting used to, but they've gone one further with this bike by fitting what it has to be said is a very blocky looking fuel tank design. Honestly, when I first saw it, I thought it was like an AI render of what the potential new GS Adventure could look like, but no, this is the real thing, and yeah, I think it's going to take a lot of people a lot of time to get used to versus the previous gen 1250 GS Adventure. The rationale, I think, is somewhat practical though. The fuel tank does have these little rubber grips along the top and you've got a very flat surface, and they say they're quite practical because it gives you somewhere to balance stuff when you're stopping off, for example. And also there are things like luggage mounts integrated into the tank to make it easier to fit stuff like a tank bag. But regardless of all that and any of the benefits that you might feel, I still think the way a bike looks is super important, and yeah, this is a very big move. It looks completely unlike any other bike on the market, and so I'd love to know what you think of it down in the comments below. The only thing I will say in its defense is that the press images that they've used to promote it are predominantly the red bike, and this gets a kind of silver finish on both the back end of the tank and the sort of leading covers as well, and it really does emphasize that squared off shape. Whereas if you click through the configurator and look at some of the other finishes like the Tramontana, which is that really nice green and gold, you've got the GS Trophy sort of finish as well, and also the triple black. Some of those finishes where it's not quite as consistent a block, and especially with the triple black and the Tramontana where it's much darker, I think it does soften the visual impact of it, and I think maybe makes it look a little easier visually to get on with. Now, the other big change for this bike that you've got to get your head around is the fact that it's the first in the lineup that they'll be offering with their new ASA system, or automated shift assistance. So you can still buy it with a manual transmission as standard, you can fit a quick shifter as well, but there's also going to be an option to fit the ASA system, and that basically works without a clutch lever and actually has electronic actuators on both the clutch and the gearbox so that it can control everything on your behalf. That means without the clutch lever, it operates very much like a twist and go in terms of pulling away and coming to a stop. So the bike's going to do all the work for you on the clutch. But for the gear selection, well, you can run it in an automatic mode where the bike's going to measure all the speed and current gear and lean angle and stuff like that and choose the right gear on your behalf. Or you can use the shifter peg and run it in a manual mode, so you're choosing the gear yourself, but it's just controlling the clutch for you. I've got to say though, interestingly from a technical perspective, that foot shifter peg doesn't mechanically have any link to the gearbox. It's just like a button effectively. Honda offers something similar with their DCT. You can get a fake foot shifter and it just then sends a message to the actuator to make that shift that you've selected. Again, another big change. It'll be interesting to see how it does. DCT has sold very well over the years, so perhaps it'll be the same here. And they are saying it will also be available, this technology, on the standard 1300GS from the 2025 model year as well. The rest of the bike, a lot of this stuff is carried over from that new 1300GS, which was first available at the beginning of this year. So you've got the new Boxer Twin with a big update. It's more powerful, more compact, there's less weight to it as well. And so this particular GS Adventure gets the same output figures as the standard bike, so that's 145 horsepower peak at 7,750 RPM and 149 Newton meters of peak torque at 6,500, so that's 10 horsepower more than the previous gen GS Adventure and 6 Newton meters more peak torque. Now, having ridden the new 1300GS quite a lot earlier this year, it does feel a lot more snappy than the 1250, a bit more punchy at the top, and while the extra power has definitely had an effect, correct. I think it's the way it works in tandem with the weight savings that they found on that particular bike, and the power to weight ratio is up and it feels more agile. And of course, yeah, when you get on the gas, it does feel more lively. The only thing I'm going to say about this GS Adventure update is that at 269 kilograms fully fueled in terms of wet weight, you know, that's 32 kilograms up on the standard 1300 GS, so naturally it's not going to feel quite as peppy. And while they have found those big weight savings on the standard bike, actually this GS Adventure, I think I'm right in saying, comes up a kilogram heavier than the 1250 version, so it should still feel a little more lively with that extra 10 horsepower, but the difference between the standard 1300 GS and the 1250 GS is going to feel greater, I think, than the difference between this bike and its 1250 predecessor. You know, a big part of that is the bigger fuel tank that you get on these bikes. So the 1300 GS gets 19 litres, this bike gets the 30 litres that you'd expect on a GS Adventure, and so of course in that wet weight you're carrying another 11 litres of fuel. But the positive side of this is it does make it absolutely exceptional in terms of range. It's pretty much the longest distance or longest range motorcycle you can buy outside of the really small capacity bikes like the 125s and stuff like that. Now there are other motorcycles on the market that also get a 30 litre fuel tank, like the Triumph Tiger 1200 Explorer models or the Ducati Multistrada V4 Rally, but what makes this bike particularly good is that the Boxer Twin gets their shift cam, variable valve lift and timing system, which means it can run quite efficiently on some less aggressive cams when you're cruising at a constant speed. So it's much more efficient and it consumes 4.9 litres of fuel per 100 kilometre travelled, whereas the Tiger 1200s are up over 5 and the Multistrada V4s, I mean, it's basically a superbike engine in an adventure bike, so they're really very thirsty. It's easily the best of the bunch, and while that 4.9 litres consumed is a little bit up on the 1250 GS Adventure, which took, I think, 4.75, it's still good enough for 612 kilometers of range in this new bike, or about 380 miles, which I think is still plenty good enough for most riders. As for the chassis, well, again, some of the updates from the 1300 GS have been carried over, so it's got that new sheet metal mainframe. This bike's got an aluminium lattice tube rear frame or subframe, which I think looks a little bit different from the pictures, but I'll have to do a bit more digging when we get to review it. And then also you've got the Evo telelever system, which has been updated on the 1300 GS. They're saying better handling, better suspension response. And so again, great to see all these updates carried over to this bigger bike. Now you do get more suspension travel on the GS Adventure, so that's 210mm at the front, 220 on the rear, and so that's 20mm up from the 190 and 200 of the standard 1300 GS. So that's the same as the 1250 GS Adventure, so good news if you like that bike. It's going to probably feel somewhat similar in the stance, although it does get some interesting updates to the suspension, like their DSA or dynamic suspension adjustment system, which admittedly you have to pay extra for, but it is quite impressive because not only does it adjust damping in real time, but it can also adjust spring rate because it's got another separate reservoir which can be opened or closed based on certain scenarios. What it means is you've got a wider range of suspension adjustments so you can compensate for different loads better, and so basically you should get better, more consistent handling regardless of whether you're riding solo or two up with luggage or fully loaded with a passenger and touring as well. Having ridden the 1300 GS earlier this year, the ride quality is absolutely fantastic. I think the telelever front end is already really good, and then this new dynamic system just means it feels great whatever the scenario, and so fully expecting for this bike to feel fantastic out on the road as well. Now naturally with that extra suspension travel you're going to get a little more ground clearance and more of that big commanding adventure bike stance, but the downside for shorter riders is of course it pushes the seat height up, so it's 870mm in its lowest setting for the seat, 890mm in the highest setting, which is really quite tall for a 269 kilogram bike, and naturally that is a little bit up, in fact the same 20mm up as the suspension travel on the 850mm standard seat height of the regular 1300 GS. Fear not though, if you like the idea of a bike with all that range and comfort and wind protection, but you're a little bit short in the leg perhaps, because this bike also gets the same adaptive ride height option as the base 1300 GS, which can take 30mm off the seat height by automatically lowering the suspension as you come to a standstill. well. So presumably if you were struggling to reach the floor, you'd be running the seat in its lower setting at 870mm, so that would bring it down to 840, which is a lot more manageable, I think. But also they say it can be fitted with the optional adaptive vehicle height control comfort system for smaller riders, snappily named, and they say it has all the features and functions of the vehicle height control, but a standard height that's 20mm lower. So I think that would take it to 850 to 870, and then with the 30mm off, that should bring it down to 820mm. So pretty manageable, I would say, and so hopefully there's something for all heights of rider, even with such a substantial bike. I've got to say as well, I've tried out that adaptive ride height system on the 1300GS that I borrowed. It was absolutely kitted out with all the accessories, and it was really very good, better than I think any other adaptive ride height I've tried. On the Pan America, for example, or the Tiger 1200, you have to manually do it with the button. It does it seamlessly, you barely notice it happening, and so what you've got is a bike that feels very manageable for such a big machine at low speeds and a standstill, but when it picks back up to speed, you've got that ground clearance and that big commanding stance and the view over the traffic that you'd expect from a big adventure bike. So again, in my experience of the 1300GS, it should be pretty good here as well. As for the tech, well, you've got 4 standard modes of Rain, Road, Eco, and Enduro, and then you can also fit out 3 more if you opt to pay for them. So that's Dynamic, Dynamic Pro, and Enduro Pro, and those ones I think offer a little more adjustability for those more advanced riders who might want a specific combination of settings. Those allow you to control some of the rider aids and their different parameters, and that includes, as standard, cornering ABS, cornering traction control, engine braking control, and hill start control. You also get dynamic cruise control with braking function as standard, which is their fancy name basically for normal cruise control, where you just pick a speed and it sticks to it, but you can opt to spec up their riding assistant package, and that adds adaptive cruise control, which will follow the vehicles in front at a set distance. So that's really handy if you're doing longer tours on the motorway, especially busy motorways where the traffic's yo-yoing a bit. And that package also includes front collision warnings, plus the rear radar for lane change warnings or blind spot warnings. And they've also got now a new feature called rear end collision warning, which I think actually sounds really very good. This is a brilliant feature that I don't think is going to get many headlines, but I think it's well thought out. You see, what this system does, it says, is signals an impending rear end collision to the following traffic by flashing the hazard warning lights with a higher frequency. So if it detects a car coming up quick behind you or another rider, it's going to give them quick flashes in both of the rear indicators, and hopefully that's going to help them to spot you and stop one of those rear end shunts, which can be really quite nasty. And I think the key thing there is that it puts the onus on the traffic behind and not you to avoid that incident, which feels much more well thought out and much more likely to result in some genuine evasive action. Again, I believe this is also available on the standard 1300GS from 2025. There's some other good standard tech on this bike as well. So you get a USB port, a 12-volt socket, their emergency call system, which is like the SOS button on the bars, that's standard as well. Tire pressure monitoring, heated grips, keyless ignition. You do have to pay for heated seats, but otherwise, you know, this thing is pretty well spec'd with the basics and beyond as it comes out the dealer. And it's really just the very advanced stuff like the radars and the fancy suspension and the self-lowering and those extra riding modes that you're going to have to spec up. Now, given that it's such a long-range capable bike, you're probably also going to want to spec it up with some luggage, and there are some new options here as well. So there's a 37-litre aluminium top case and then over 73 litres of side case storage. So 37 litres on the left, 36.5 on the right, I guess a little less maybe because of the exhaust system. So yeah, that's 73.5 in total. Plus the top case, that's going to give you, I think, 110.5. It's got a magnetic coupling with an electronic interface, and so that means there's a USB socket in the left-hand case for charging your devices, and also an optional 10-litre extension for each of those side cases if you do need even more storage. Plus, on top of that, a 12-litre tank bag with a waterproof lining that's going to hook into those integrated mounting points on the tank, so should be plenty. And of course, I reckon as usual, there'll be plenty of options available from third parties as well. Now, onto the price, and it's going to start at £18,870, which is quite a bit up from the £16,360 of the previous gen 1250 GS Adventure. Now, The thing is with the BMWs, you know, that's a very basic spec usually, and you have to start speccing them up with the configurator to get a like-for-like comparison with some of the competition. The configurator isn't working with all the prices for the individual accessories and packages yet, so we'll have to wait probably when I give it a full review to get a proper comparison with some of the other bikes on the market. But what they have said is with the automated shift assistant, it will start at 21,300, so that's nearly $3,000. It's about $2,500, I guess, for that system, which I think is roughly what you'd be looking to pay for DCT on some of the Honda bikes, for example. And then, yeah, for initial context, the Tiger 1200 Rally Pro, which is probably the most comparable bike in that lineup, starts at 19,695, although that does get a lot of accessories like a rear radar, heated seats. The Ducati Multistrada V4 Rally, well, that starts at 23,590. And yeah, so that's quite expensive, but that's to be expected from Ducati. Both of those make 18,870 sound quite reasonable as a starting price, but like I say, we'll come up with some more direct similar specs for a proper comparison when that pricing becomes available. As always, I'd love to know what you think of it, so do let me know down in the comments below. And also, if you want to see my full review of the 1300GS, which I shot earlier this year, there's a lot of shared componentry and features, and I'll put that on the screen now so you can give it a click and give it a watch if you haven't already. Do hit subscribe as well if you want to see more of the latest motorcycle news like this right here on YouTube. And massive thanks for watching today, and we'll see you next time.